Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you all and everyone to this annual Deborah Lee lecture. But before I say a little bit about the lecture and about our lecturer, Mr. Stanley Nelson, I want to just give a few words of thanks. I want to thank most profoundly Ms. Shana Weinberg from the center and Maya Gamble Rivers, two persons who have worked very hard to make this lecture series a success and to really give a really good brown treatment to Mr. Nelson. So thank you very much, Maya. Thank you very much, Shana, who are both of whom are the, as I like to call them, the administrative engines of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. Also would like to thank the folks from Media Services who are here shooting today. I recognize these faces and they are at many of our functions, so I would like to publicly thank them for doing this today. What is the annual Deborah Lee Lecture? Deborah Lee is an alum of Brown and is the current president of BET, Black Entertainment Television. She's also the co-chair of the External Advisory Board of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. And she has endowed a lecture series in which we ask folks to come and speak about slavery and justice and other related matters. So I would like to thank Ms. Lee for her generosity in endowing this lecture series annually, which she has done so for over 5 years. Today, we are deeply honored to have, as this year's lecturer, Mr. Stanley Nelson, filmmaker and director. Mr. Nelson can be described or considered as and I put that "the" in italics, emphasized, the premier historical documentarian filmmaker of the African American life in the United States. He works within a particular tradition, one in which individuals like William Greaves was a seminal figure. This is a tradition in which African American life, with all its human complexities, becomes the subject of the screen. It is one in which visual history of African American life is told, where the vicissitudes of living in America as black life in America is told in stories which both provoke and evoke. I think it is fair to say that Mr. Nelson has brought to this specific tradition of African American documentary filmmaking two things. One, a preoccupation with the institutions of African American life. So his things on the black press, then his most recent documentary on the historically black colleges tell us that fact. And secondly, though, he has brought a gaze in which the actual structures of black life, and particularly black politics, are foregrounded in the stories that he has told. So that, for example, his story or his documentary on Marcus Garvey, Look for Me in the Whirlwind, and his most recent historical documentary, The Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution. He has produced, therefore, a body of historical documentaries, in fact, over 20 of them. And in these documentaries, as I said, what you get is a visual history of African American life. And not just a visual history, but a very sensitively drawn set of visual histories which are layered in often with music, African American music, that oftentimes drives the stories and the visuals. For this vast body of work, over 20 documentaries, he has been awarded many times. The Peabody Award, the National Humanities Medal, and the MacArthur Fellow Award. I think one of the things he's most proud of, just from my conversation with him over the last 2 days, is a documentary company that he has founded in which he encourages young black filmmakers to work with him and to learn about documentary filmmaking. So therefore, for us at the center and for us at Brown, it is a deep honor to have Mr. Nelson as our Deborah Lee Lecturer for 2017. Mr. Stanley Nelson.
I want to thank everybody so much for coming. I want to doubly thank the people who were here last night who returned for more punishment. Thank you so much for coming. And I also want to thank the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice for being so kind and feeding me so well that right before we came over here, I fell asleep. So if you see me sipping coffee, it's because of them, because they gave me so much food. What I want to do is I'm going to just talk a little bit about my career in filmmaking and show some clips from films. And we really want to have time for question and answer at the end. So please think of some questions if you have them. I'd love to answer them. But we're going to I'm going to jump through some very short clips from films that I've made over the past almost 30 years. And also talk about kind of how I got here and why I got here, because I think that's my story, really. I think one of the most important things to know about my filmmaking is how I grew up. So I grew up in the 50s and the 60s. I was born in 1951, and when I grew up watching TV, there were no black people on TV in the 50s and the early 60s. And that's really hard for people who weren't around in that era to understand, because they think that I'm exaggerating. But there were no black people on TV. There were no Latino people, there were no Asians, there were no gay people, nothing on TV. But there, you didn't see black people at all. The only time you saw black people is when, James Brown or Duke Ellington and his band or somebody might be performing on Ed Sullivan or a variety show. And then, your phone would start ringing and it would be, family friends saying, turn on the TV, there's a black person on there. It was so stark that I remember, as a kid, there was a situation comedy called The Dick Van Dyke Show. Anybody ever seen Dick Van Dyke? Okay, Dick Van Dyke was a regular situation comedy, and about Dick Van Dyke and his wife, who was Mary Tyler Moore before she had her own show, and he had a son. And I always remember this episode that I saw of that show when I was about 10 or 12, because Dick Van Dyke gets convinced that his son is acting so weird that he gets convinced that his son is not his son, that somehow the babies got switched up in the hospital and he's got the wrong kid, and this kid is 12, but he finds out somehow who the people were in the room next to his when his wife had the baby, and he invites them over for dinner because he's going to let them know that he's got the wrong kid. And they ring the bell and it's a black couple. And I just remember that because I was just so startled, and that it suddenly came to me that I had never seen a black person on TV. And I came later to find out that this is a hugely famous episode of the Dick Van Dyke Show. It's really famous. There was an article in the Times about it a couple of years ago, but I didn't know that. But just as a kid, it stuck with me because it was just so weird, because we never saw black people on TV. And then something started to happen as I was in college, and there was this thing called the blaxploitation films, and we started to see black people, kind of in films, like Superfly and Shaft, and those were the better ones, and Blackula, and those films. And all of a sudden, there were black people in front of the camera, and these films, most of them were really, really, really bad. And I started to think, well, maybe there's a shot. Maybe I have a shot. I can make a bad film too. Let me try to get in there and make a bad film like that. And I just kind of dropped in and took a class at college. I was bouncing around college. This was in the early 70s. I knew that if I stayed in college, I wouldn't have to go to Vietnam, which was the thing that was really important to me. And so I took a film course, and I kind of liked it. And I, thought, well, let me try to make films. Let me try to do this. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to show the people that I knew. I didn't know, pimps and hustlers. Those weren't the people that I knew. My father was a dentist, and my mother was a librarian. And that's something that, we'll get into this later, but that's something that in some ways is very hard to admit, because, there was a time, one time we were arguing, in the edit room about something, and, this is three black people talking about keeping it real, and it took a lot of courage for me to say, I am keeping it real. My father was a dentist, and my mother was a librarian. That's where I came from. But I wanted to make films about the people and the things that I knew about. I think one of the things that happened during that period that's really kind of interesting is that documentary films did not make any money. Nobody was getting rich off documentary films. People who made documentary films were trying. They were on a mission. So I went into it on a mission. I got a job with a guy named William Greaves, Bill Greaves, who was kind of my mentor. And, he was on a mission. But I also saw that he was one of the first black people making films, documentary films, who was able to support. He had a family. He supported his family. He was independent. And I saw that there was a way to do it. And he was a great influence on me and my filmmaking, partially in just seeing that there was a model there. There was a way to do it. So that's kind of how I got into it. I was kind of bouncing around the film industry and doing a little bit of everything. And the story of Madam C.J. Walker was kind of bouncing around my family. My grandfather worked with Madam C.J. Walker. He was her attorney and partner. And it was kind of a story that bounced around my family of this woman who made $1 million, this black woman. And at that point, this was in the early 80s, nobody knew that story. It wasn't a commonly known story. And me and my cousins went into the Walker Building in Indianapolis, where the company was headquartered. And my uncle, who still kind of worked for the company, let us in on a rainy Saturday in the fall of 1981. And we went through the building. They had this 4-story building with flashlights. And we found all these things. We found boxes and boxes of pictures dating back to 1910. We found glass slides that they had used, these hand-painted glass slides in the 20s that the Walker Company had used. We found cases of letters from the 20s. And we found a film that the company had produced in the 20s about the company, a silent film with the old title cards, and that really set me off. That really made me feel like, wait a minute, there's a story to be told here, and there's a way to tell it, and also that there's archival material sitting around in places that you just have to look. Madam C.J. Walker's company was an amazing company. It was run by Madam C.J. Walker. All the main officers of the company were women. This is starting in 1915, going up to 1930, except my grandfather, who was kind of the attorney, but all the rest of the people who worked for the company and ran the company were women. And so that's one of the things that kind of started us off and made us say, okay, we can make this film. The other thing that was really interesting to me about making that film and kind of set my career off in a different way was that we were looking for music, to kind of, how do you tell this story through music? How do you use music so it's not just talking heads? And we talked to a bunch of historians, and there was a woman named Rosetta Wrights who put out these blues records, these blues albums. Like she put out an album called Wild Women Sing the Blues. They're kind of feminist blues albums. Another one called, Blues Ladies Don't Get Sad, stuff like that. And I got to be her friend, and I asked her about, songs that might help us make this film. And she said, well, there's a song called Nappy Headed Blues. And I've heard of this song called Nappy Headed Blues, but I've never heard it myself. I just heard that there's a song called Nappy Headed Blues. And it took us 7 years to make this film. And maybe the 6th year into the film, at this point, of course, there's no internet. We're in the 80s, and we're calling around all over the country trying to find this song, Nappy Headed Blues, among other things. We're trying to find all these other songs, and we're asking about Nappy Headed Blues. And finally, we end up talking to this guy who's a music collector in Vancouver. And we said, well, have you ever heard of this song, Nappy Headed Blues? He said, yeah, I got it. And we're like, really? He said, yeah, I got it. Send me $5 and I'll make a cassette tape and I'll send it to you. So we're like, okay, that sounds good. So we send him the $5. He sends back the tape, and the first verse of the song is, my hair is can't you, don't you can't comb it, don't you try. Nappy, that's the reason why. And it goes on, and the last verse of the song is, going to Madam Walker, give her a $50 bill. Going to Madam Walker, give her a $50 bill. Ask her to help a young girl, if you will. And I can still remember that moment when me and the associate producer were sitting there, and we heard them start talking about Madam Walker coming out of the cassette machine, and we just looked at each other like, is this for real? Are we in some kind of a nutty dream? And so that became the beginning of the film, which I'll show with help from my helper here, my reluctant helper. But also I think it drove me to understand that there's a lot of incredible archival stuff out there if you just look for it and push for it and kind of do it with a smile on your face. But it also changes the production. It changed the whole way this film opens and the way this film is, just because we found that song. So I'm gonna play you the first couple of minutes of this film. I have to say that in some ways I wish I could go back and do this film over again. This film was done, with very little money. I was the editor. I did the sound. My sister is a narrator. My mother is one of the first people you see who talks about, she was one of the first women's lib people. I think that's how my mother puts it. So it was a real kind of a family production, but we got it done. So I'm gonna show you the first couple minutes. This is the kind of the first major film I ever did. I want to just say thank you, Claire, who actually premiered the film for the first time in like 1986. So, 1986, premiered the film, and she's having to walk in. So it's incredible to have you here. So let's just take a look at that.
As the first woman in history to start with nothing and earn her own $1 million fortune. Her name was Madam C.J. Walker, and this is her story.
My hair is can't you, don't you? You can't comb it, don't you try?
She didn't know anything about black as beautiful. But if it came right down to it, what she did was make it beautiful.
Just like Kookaburra, Nappy, that's the reason why.
At that time, Madam Walker's name was known all over the South. There wasn't a creek, a puddle, a river, or nothing that if there was one Negro there, they knew about Madam Walker.
Straightening or burning makes no difference, I don't care.
It was quite an important thing to black women particularly, and I think really in the history of the whole women's movement, very important to all women in the country.
Gotta smooth these knots out, got to be an Indian queen.
The Nappy-Headed Blues, as this song is entitled, reflected an attitude shared by many black Americans at the turn of the century. According to the song, my hair is can't you, don't you? You can't comb it, don't you try. Nappy, that's the reason why. In those days, nappy hair was considered a problem by just about everyone, except Madam C.J. Walker. She was born Sarah Breedlove in 1867 to slaves newly freed by the Civil War in this cabin in Delta, Louisiana. Married at 14, widowed with a daughter, Aurelia, at 20, she had little other than her dreams. Dreams, she said, of a magic formula that would solve those nappy-headed blues. For Madam C.J. Walker, these nappy heads would become her fortune, although she began with only $2 and a dream.
Wrote to Madam Walker, send a $50 bill. Wrote to Madam Walker, send a $50 bill. Said, send me some for me, help a poor girl if you will.
So that's the opening of. That's the opening of $2 and a Dream. It's a comedy for those who didn't get that. And one of the things that happened when the film aired, so the film, aired nationally on PBS. We screened it at a film market. I remember a representative from PBS was there, and they said, "Oh yeah, we want to show your film." And I said, "Great, how much you want to pay?" They were like, "No, you don't get it. We want to show your film, but we're really not going to pay you anything." Finally, because I'm a great deal maker, I made a deal for them to pay $10,000 so I could pay off my lab fees and get the film shown. And that was the best I could do. I remember sitting there, and this thing aired nationally. It was like it had a little box in the New York Times. It's like the film, the show to watch for the day. And I kind of sat there when the film aired, like looking at my phone, knowing that, I was going to get a call from, I don't know who I thought, Cecil B. DeMille or somebody, was going to call me and sign me up. And when the phone didn't ring, I learned a lesson. And that was, you kind of got to have your next film ready and push yourself, because it doesn't work like that in documentary film, or it didn't work like that then. And so that was how $2 and a Dream worked out for me. One of the things, I learned, though, in making this film was that I really wanted to work in films and let people try to tell their own stories, and really wanted people to tell their own stories. I thought that wasn't being done, especially for African Americans. I think that one of the things that that I feel, and it's one of the through lines to everything I do that got me into filmmaking, was that we needed to tell our own stories. That you know, the stories are just so much deeper when they're told from the inside rather than the outside. You know, I didn't want to be accused of that guy who's interpreting black culture to white folks. You know, there's that, you know, one of the jokes that we have around the office is, you know, like in the old Tarzan movies, right? There's, you know, they're walking through the jungle and you hear the drums beating, you know, and the white guys turn to the natives and say, well, what do those drums mean? And they say, Bwana, the natives are mad. And, you know, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to really make films that told black people something about themselves. And the feeling was that if you're telling black folks something about themselves, then you're also telling white folks something that they didn't know. You know, so that's kind of how we look at it, and what I try to do in the films that I make. How do you tell black folks something that's new to them about their own culture and their own selves? I think one of the tricks for us and me is how do you tell these stories from the inside, but how do you have this what I call a semblance of a objectivity? You know, so the films really have this surface of objectivity, but they're told from the inside. We're trying not to tell stories that, you know, you can kind of say, there goes Stanley again with his stuff, that are very, you know, rooted historically. One of the things we really learned, you know, after making this film was that, you know, whether I'm a historian or not, and I'm not, I went to film school, you know, is that that's how we're looked at. That more people are going to get their history from seeing, you know, these films than are going to read, any major scholarly historical book. So people are going to see this as history. So we try to be as rigorous as we can with the work that we do on these films. Also, we're going to constantly be challenged, and we know that. You know, when we did the film on the Black Panthers 2 years ago, we were constantly challenged by Breitbart, who would hire people to write these long essays about the film and then send them to the comptroller, the ombudsman of PBS. And the ombudsman would send them to us, and then we would have to answer these long things. I mean, and they were really well researched and very detailed, except they were wrong. So, you know, it was very easy for us to kind of say, well, you know, I don't really understand. So, to you know, one of their points was, you know, they would take when Huey Newton shoots was alleged to have shot a policeman, you know, they would say, well, you said it was at 2 a.m. in the morning, but it was really 4 a.m. And you said it was on this corner, but it was really on that corner. And Huey was, and why don't you talk about the fact that Huey was, you know, put on trial for murder, and we would then have to answer it. So it was really essential for us to be able to answer those questions and know that we could answer those questions going in. So the research was always something that we really take really great care of, and you know, we have to produce a Bible, what we call a Bible at the end, which every single fact, every single statement in the film has backed up by at least 2 sources, and we submit that with the film to PBS, whoever the film is made for, and that's kind of our backup. I wanted to next show a piece of Garvey, of a film that we did on Marcus Garvey, this was a film that I really I did after $2 and a Dream that took 7 years to make. The next film I made was a film on the black press, a black newspaper. It's called Soldiers Without Swords. It took another 7 years to make. And a lot of times, you hear documentary filmmakers talk about how long it takes to make a film. And they give you these, outlandish numbers, 7 years, 10 years, and things like that. Yeah, and it's true, but I think that for most filmmakers, it's because it takes that long to raise the money. If a filmmaker tells you that it takes them 7 to 10 years just to make the film, then maybe they have a problem making decisions. But it took that long just to raise the money to make these films. But after we made 2003, we made The Black Press, and that took another 7 years. But one of the fascinating things for us was we came in contact with Marcus Garvey's paper. The paper of the United Negro Improvement Association, which was just an incredible paper, and we really couldn't give it its due in the film about black newspapers, and we really wanted to do more on Garvey. This was a paper. One of the things Garvey did was tie people from the African diaspora together, and so his film, his newspaper would have articles about black folks all over the Caribbean, all over South America, in Africa, in the United States. It was just really a really interesting paper. And so that kind of got us talking about doing a film on Garvey. And so I'm going to show you the end of the film on Garvey, because one of the fascinating things for me about that film, when I think about the film, is we cut this ending of the film probably within the first month of us being in the edit room, and I spend a lot of time in the edit room. I spend usually, it's embarrassing to say, but we can spend 9 months easy in the edit room. Just editing. 9 months is not outlandish for us. We probably cut this ending pretty much as it is right here, the first month. And it was really hard because we knew then that we had to try to get you to this moment. And how do we get you, so that you'll feel what we felt in this last moment of the film. Let's just roll this last little couple minutes of Garvey.
Garvey had a stroke in January of 1940, and he becomes incapacitated. George Padmore, who was a columnist for the Chicago Defender, had heard a rumor that Garvey had died, and instead of confirming this, he published a premature obituary.
The obituary described Garvey as a man whose followers had deserted him, a man who died broke, alone, and unpopular.
When Garvey reads it, he lets out a loud moan and he collapses. He suffers a second stroke. And next morning, he dies.
The date was June 10th, 1940. Marcus Garvey died a forgotten man. But his vision of Africa would influence future generations of what he called the beloved and scattered millions of the Negro race. When Garvey's passionate ideas about black pride and independence finally took hold, he would be revered by many as a prophet and a saint.
In death, I shall be a terror to the foes of Negro liberty. Look for me in the whirlwind or the song of the storm. Look for me all around you.
In his 53 years, Marcus Garvey never set foot in Africa.
I dreamed a dream that he came and I saw him. And he said to me, Barnes, do not be worried, for everything is working according to plan. I am not dead, I am only sleeping.
The organization left the legacy of I am. Simply, I am. With no apology. I am. We had never had that up to that time. We belonged to churches where we sang, but Garvey made you stand tall and quiet, looking into the future. And that's a great legacy.
I've been really lucky to be able to tell these stories, and if anything that I have, I think it's partially my ability to see that for the 100th time and cry again about it, because it's just to me it's just an amazing clip, the beloved and scattered millions, it's just. Anyway, so one of the things that happened with that clip is we had that song, and we had a composer. We had stolen that song from somewhere, that music, and we had a composer who was good, and we kept trying to get him to get something close to that, and he couldn't, and we ended up having to buy that song, besides everything else. And they always say, like, don't put in temp music because you may love it and then you have to buy it, and so that's what we had there. We had to buy that because we couldn't find anything better. But it was very strange, kind of having the ending and not having the film. It was a very strange place to be. I think one of the things that happened for me is that. I learned that if films are going to take so long to make, 7 years to make, 7 years to make, then I wanted to make films that were important to me. It had to be something that was really important to me. It had to be something that I felt had something more than just the story. There was something more to it. It had, it's not something that exists in kind of this, what I call a historical bubble. I unfortunately, I always make the case of a film that I saw that talks about Aaron Burr and Hamilton, that actually has a lot of significance now since the play. But it was this beautifully done film, and it goes to the duel and everything like that. And after I saw it, I was like, yeah, well, that was really good. Let me go get a hamburger, because I didn't understand what it had to do with anything that had to do with my life and had to do with anything in modern day. And so one of the things I'm trying to do is, if I'm making a film, if it's going to take this amount of effort and time, then I want it to have some kind of resonance to what's going on with our lives today and my life today. I think that's really important. I think the other thing to understand is for me, filmmaking is not easy. When I talk about my career, or my life in film, when I started out, I had a lot of hair and it was black. Filmmaking is not simple. It's really, agonizing. And when I talk about and I show these clips, it kind of looks like, oh, well, you go from one film to the next. But I think another way to look at it is, if somebody's written a good book, it doesn't mean that the next book is going to be any good, right? They've written a good book, and that's kind of how filmmaking is. And a lot of times I tackle these big subjects, and then and I'm really gung ho about it, and then we finally raise the money, and then we're like, oh God, now what? Now we have to actually make the film, and how are we going to do that? And there's a lot of pressure on, for me. I mean, this is the story of Marcus Garvey, and I feel like, my parents and all my ancestors are sitting on my shoulders, saying, don't mess this up, Stanley. You better not mess this one up. And so it is a lot of pressure and tension that happens in making these projects, at least for me, and I think for a lot of filmmakers. I think one of the things that's really important for me is to think about, what do these stories mean? What's the bigger meaning of these stories? And I want to show a clip from The Murder of Emmett Till. This is the beginning of Emmett Till. And one of the things that we were doing here was that we did. Has anybody here seen Citizen Kane, the movie Citizen Kane? Yeah, well, if you know Citizen Kane, one of the things about that film that's so amazing is they kind of tell you the whole story, and then they tell you the story again, then they go back and kind of lay the story out moment by moment. And that's kind of what we were trying to do here. We said, let's just tell the story at the beginning, and then let's lay it out, and then let's lay it out in slow motion as we go. So I wanted to take a quick look at this. Is the opening of the murder of Emmett Till, and I think it was here that I started thinking about how do you make film more cinematic? How do you make documentary films more cinematic? How do you make them bigger? How do you make it look like a movie and sound like a movie? And so one of the things we started to do here was we went out and we shot these kind of beautiful shots of in Mississippi, because we wanted to give an idea of what it looked like, Mississippi looked like and sounded like and felt like. So we'll just look at this first little what we call the tease. This is the very beginning.
This is the muddy backwoods Tallahatchie River, where a weighted body was found, alleged to be that of young Emmett Till.
I saw a hole, which I presumed was a bullet hole, and I could look through that hole and see daylight on the other side. And I wondered, was it necessary to shoot it?
Here is Money, Mississippi, the home of Roy Bryant. It was here that the Chicago Negro boy, Emmett Till, is alleged to have paid unwelcome attention to Roy Bryant's most attractive wife.
When white women was on the streets, you had to get off of the street. That was a way of life. And all a white woman would have to say was, that nigger kind of looked at me, or sassed me. So we're talking about a way of life that in this part of the country that was enforced by law.
This was the home of Mose Wright. It was from this shack the state alleges Emmett Till was taken by Roy Bryant and J.W. Marlin.
The house was as dark as 1,000 midnights. You couldn't see. It was like a nightmare. I mean, someone come and stand over you with a pistol in one hand, a flashlight, and you're 16 years old. This is a terrifying experience.
The Till case held the whole system up for inspection by the rest of the country and by the rest of the world. It was the beginning of the focusing on the problems between the races in the Deep South that culminated in the ultimate civil rights battles of the rest of the 50s and into the 60s.
I think black people's reaction was so visceral, and I think it was probably more than anything else in terms of the mass civil rights movement, the spark that launched it. Everybody knew we were under attack, and that attack was symbolized by the attack on a 14-year-old boy.
So that's the beginning of Emmett Till, and what we wanted to do was lay out there that it is this story. I mean, it's a kind of a straight story. You know, he goes down to the South. He whistles at this white woman. They murder him. They get arrested. They get acquitted. You know, but it's also so much bigger than that, and we wanted to lay all of that out there from the very beginning. You know, that this story was much bigger than the story of Emmett Till. And why we're telling you this story, you know, it's something that's a huge story. So that was kind of how we came to kind of starting the film that way, and kind of jumping ahead to the trial and some other things that happened. You know, the trial's probably not until 3/4 of the way through the film. I wanted to. I wanted to show a clip of a film that's very, very different, a film called A Place of Our Own. It's a film about, it's the only film I've ever made that's personal. It's about my family. It's about Martha's Vineyard and the black middle class, and something that I really, it's very different. This film came about because, you know, I was trying to think about how to do a film about the black middle class, and we started this film in like 2001, maybe 2000, somewhere around that, 2000, 2001, and we were trying to think about how do you make. I really want to make a film about the black middle class. Again, part of it came out of sitting in that edit room, you know, with an editor who, you know, is one of the top editors, and he and his wife were like breaking through the wall of their apartment to make a duplex and take over 2 apartments and build a stairway, with the associate producer whose father's a doctor who lives up in the suburbs of New York with a swimming pool, and me. And I said something about my parents being, you know, a doctor, a dentist, and a librarian, and they were like, "Well, not us. You know, we're keeping it real. You know, our parents are, we're from the ghetto." And I was like, "Well, you know, I don't know." And I thought about, you know, how at that point, at least, we talked very little about the black middle class. And I wanted to try to make a film that just kind of put it out there. It started out to be a film about different 3 or 4 different black resorts, because we thought that it would be really interesting to look at the black middle class, black upper middle class through different resorts that exist. So one was Martha's Vineyard, one was American Beach down in Florida, Idlewild out in the Midwest, and I forgot what the other one, Highland something. And so we couldn't get the money to do those films, and so, you know, we just then made it a film about Martha's Vineyard. It was very different making a personal film. It was very, you know, one of the things that I learned when we made the film was it's not like a straight story. It's not like a story like Emmett Till, where, you know, Emmett Till has to get on the train, he has to go down south, he has to whistle at this white woman. Those things have to happen. When you make a film like Place of Our Own, anything could come in, anything could go out, and we spent a lot of time, you know, arguing about what should go in the film, what should go out, and I really feel really proud of. There's a kind of a conversation that my wife and I have on the beach, where we talk about, you know, what it means to be black, and what it means to be black in a world where, for most black middle class people, upper middle class people, you deal in a world that's dominated by white folks, and that was something that we hadn't really heard talked about, you know, in film, and so we really pressed to try to make that work. So why don't we take a look at this? Is kind of somewhere in the middle of this film, a couple of minutes from the middle of this film. Nothing in the way I grew up could compare to my father's experience of segregation. I was the product of the black upper middle class life my father pushed so hard to reach. But as I got older, I was uncomfortable being one of the few black kids in a sea of white faces. By the time I was a teenager, I started looking at my classmates differently. And I knew that on some deep, unspoken level, I wasn't really one of them. On the other hand, I couldn't just take the subway up to Harlem and hang out on a street corner. And I was afraid I would be teased for my bougie roots, the way I talked, walked, and danced. But in Oak Bluffs, it was different. I learned so much of black culture on the Vineyard. I remember learning how to slow dance, up here, when I was about 13 or so. A group of us didn't go to the beach. It was 90 degrees outside. We were in somebody's living room. We played the same slow record, Sad Girl, over and over again. We were in our bathing suits, sweating, grinding.
That was what you learned about black culture, how to grind.
Right. That was the most important thing. That was the most important thing I learned about black culture, was how to grind. The rest was gravy. There's some black people, middle class, upper middle class black people, who go to white schools, live in white neighborhoods. You kind of pity them because they never make the connection with black people. Right. So they're lost, But the Vineyard helped me, so I didn't ever feel lost. Right. I didn't feel excluded from white people and from white culture because I had something that was better.
Take 'em up, Fred. We gotta take you high, yeah.
So I think that was the hardest film I ever made. It was really different for me to make that film. It was really, it was really hard for me to talk about myself. And I think the only way that film ever got made was what they did. I had a great editor and my wife, who helped write it, and an associate producer, and they would write out these questions, and they would have me go into a room by myself with a tape recorder and just answer and just talk about these questions on tape. And I think what finally made the film work was I was so convinced that nobody would ever see this film, that there was no way that anybody would ever want to see this film, and it would never reach the light of day, that I was able to just go in there and talk freely about stuff. And then the editor kind of took that and shaped it into a narrative. But the thing to understand about personal films is they're more constructed, or just as constructed as any other film, right? So I would be reading the narration, right? And I was in a booth reading the narration that we wrote, and I was like, and somewhere in my teens, I came to realize that I was different from them, and I would never be like them. That I was, and they would say, okay, no, do it again, and can you sound a little sadder? And so somewhere in my teens, I realized that I was different from them, that I would never be like them. I mean, it was constructed. It was very constructed, and that's just part of filmmaking. But it was not a simple film to make. But it's interesting that I'll never say never, but I will never make that another personal film. But people relate to personal films in a very, very different way than other films. About a year after this film came out, there's a lot in the film about my family and about kind of my kind of butting heads with my sister and arguments with my sister and stuff like that. And I was in Martha's Vineyard again, and I was getting out of the water on the beach, and this kid comes up to me, he's about 12, and he says, hey, you made that film, right? And I said, yeah, I guess so, I did. And he said, well, ever since I saw your film, I'm trying to be nicer to my sister. And so I think that made it all worthwhile, that this one kid is trying to be a little bit nicer to his sister. Is this where we have to skip some stuff, right? So we may as well start skipping. Sure, sorry. I think one of the things that really happened for me is after we made Emmett Till, which was about an incident that happened in 1955, and we realized that if you can get this combination of history, but it's near past enough that you can actually find people to interview who were there, and you still have what it's like this sweet spot. You still have this footage that looks old enough that you have this kind of magic thing that's going. It was so much easier in some ways than making the Garvey film, that we actually did find people who were part of the Garvey movement, but they were all in their 90s. But after Emmett Till, we said, if you have that combination, you can really, you really have gold. And I think I'm going to show a clip from Freedom Riders, which was a film where, we had, it was 61, we had most of the freedom people who were part of the Freedom Rides were teenagers, so they were still fairly young when we interviewed them. I mean, they were, in their 60s, but they were vibrant. This was a time that was one of the greatest times in their lives. It was a time when they did something that was much bigger than themselves, and a lot of times people weren't asked. Nobody comes up to this woman who's 70 years old, who's in line behind you in the supermarket, and says, what did you do in 1961? Nobody asked them these questions, so they hadn't had a chance to tell their story. So a lot of times people say, oh, these films, you did these great interviews, but a lot of times it's just, I just ask one question and people go for it, because we're giving them a chance to tell their story. Just a quick bit about the archives here. Two things. One is at the end of this clip, there's this footage of the bus burning. And one of the things that happened, and this is again about research and the lengths that we go, is this is about an incident that happened outside of Anniston in Alabama, where the Freedom Riders bus was burnt. And after the bus was burnt, the FBI held hearings about the bus burning. Of course, the FBI, in its typical fashion, held hearings but didn't do anything. But they held hearings, and we were reading the transcripts of the hearings, and this one guy said, well, I live down the road from there, about a half a mile down the road, and when they started rioting and burning the bus, my son ran out with his Super 8 camera and started filming. And he filmed the bus being burnt, and he said in the transcript, he said, but I don't have that film anymore because the FBI confiscated it. So we went to the FBI and we said, do you have this film? And they said, what film? So we Xeroxed the pages and sent the pages from the transcript to the FBI and said, well, this guy said you confiscated this film. And they said, okay, well, we'll get right back to you. And about 5 months later, we get this call, and the FBI says, oh, yeah, so we found the film. Do you want it? And we said, yeah, great. And so this is the film is included in here that we found, that the FBI found. And I to this day think that what happened was the FBI really went out of its way to try to find this film, because what does it say about the FBI if they confiscate stuff and then they lose it, right? That's not the FBI that we know, right? When they confiscate stuff, they know right where it is. It's in box 401-237B. And so they found it and sent it to us, and we were able to use it. Another thing is there's this woman in here, I'm sorry, whose name I forgot, this has been a few years back, they made this film, who was a little girl at the time, and she lived about a block away, and she had this story, and we didn't film her, and we didn't film her, and we didn't film her, and then we filmed her on the very last shoot that we did. We went out to California, and we were filming some other things, and we filmed her, and you'll see how precarious films are, because we almost didn't film her, and she turns the whole film upside down. I'm gonna cry again. Here she is.
This car that was in front of us kept dodging from side to side to keep the bus from getting by.
I spoke to a innocent passenger who was sitting there and said, "I'm sorry I got you into this." And he said, "So am I."
Eventually, we heard that sickening sound of tires going flat.
There was a commotion outside, so I walked to the front of the store to see if I could tell what was going on. The bus driver came out, and he went out to look at the tires, and when he realized how flat and hopeless they were, he just walked away from the bus and just left all the passengers to fend for themselves. He just walked away.
We were now in the hands of this mob. It didn't look good for us.
I'm like everyone else on the bus. I'm pretty afraid, okay? That's putting it mildly.
I watched as a man raised his arm above the crowd with a crowbar, and he broke out one of the back windows of the bus.
You could hear him saying, throw it in, and asking, where is the gas, where is the gas?
The hand went down, and when it came back up, it had some object in it that he threw into that hole.
And there was immediate flash fire on the bus.
Pretty soon, the whole back of the bus was black. You couldn't even see in front of your face.
So I ran up to the front of the bus, and I tried to open the door. Only thing I could hear is, "Let's burn them niggas. Let's burn them niggas alive." At that moment, the fuel tank exploded. I heard somebody say, "It's gonna go, it's gonna go." And they ran, and that was the only way we could get that door open.
The door burst open and people just spilled out into the yard. They were practically tripping over each other because they were so sick and they needed to get some air.
I can't tell you if I walked off the bus or if I crawled off or someone pulled me off.
When I got off the bus, a man came up to me, and I'm coughing and strangling. He said, "Boy, you all right?" And I nodded my head, and the next thing I knew, I was on the ground. He had hit me with part of a baseball bat.
People were gagging and they were crawling around on the ground. They were trying to get the smoke out of their chest. It was just an awful, 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 awful scene.
It was horrible. It was like a scene from hell. It was the worst suffering I'd ever heard. And I heard, "Water, please give me water. Oh God, I need water." I walked right out into the middle of that crowd. I picked me out one person. I washed her face. I held her. I gave her water to drink. And as soon as I thought she was gonna be okay, I got up and picked out somebody else.
As I'm getting up off the ground, 4 or 5 guys coming at me again. And this is when I see the highway patrolman. He pulls his gun and he fired in the air. He says, "Okay, you've had your fun. Let's move back." And that's what stopped it.
So that's that scene. We were just really lucky in a lot of ways. Alabama's so strange, that there was one guy there who took all the still pictures, and what people said, in Alabama, even to this day was, he was a Northerner, and he was a guy who was a Northerner, and he worked for the newspaper down there as a photographer, because their implication was that a Southern photographer from that area wouldn't have even taken the pictures, but he took all those pictures. He actually had somebody lift him up, and he took pictures inside the bus, and then there's the footage that the FBI gave us. I see. I mean, the trick of that scene is that I had people tell me that they're the same story, from 4 or 5 different angles. They were all there. I just was very patient and had them all tell me, what they saw, what they heard, what they felt. And a lot of times I'll say, what did you see? What did you smell? What did you hear? Where she says, I heard, give me water. That was my question was, what did you hear? Tell me what you heard. And she said, I heard them say, give me water, give me water. That's what that, and so that's how we kind of, put that scene together. We wanted to try to make it so you were there, that as a viewer you were there with the Freedom Riders. All those people, if you haven't seen the film, all those people you follow from the first day that they get on the Freedom Rides, where they think they're going to go down and kind of ride through the South and it's all going to work out. Anyway, I want to just, you got a few more minutes? Okay, just want to show real quick. I think the next thing I was going to show was the Black Panthers. A lot of people here saw it. So I want to talk a little bit. We're just going to show the very beginning of the Black Panther film, and because we really wanted to try to do something there. So this was a film on the Black Panthers. So we thought that everybody's going to come in, to the theater or turn on their TV, expecting to see a film, with black men with guns and their arms folded, looking mean and mad. That's what people are going to, when they say Black Panthers, that's what people are going to be looking for. We wanted to start the film with something different. We wanted to start the film with something that would almost make you say, wait a minute, did I come in the wrong theater? What are they talking about here? And we were interviewing Erica Huggins, and she told us this story about the blind man and the elephant. And we just said, okay, let's go with that. Let's start the film with that. One of the things that happened for us in editing is we actually found a little animation of the story of the blind man and the elephant that was just on YouTube. So we typed in blind man and elephant, and this little animation came up. So we were able to put that in the film and use that while we were editing, before we did our own animation, and this is the animation that we did. Also, what happened was Erica could kind of tell the story, but she goofed it up a lot. She messed up the story. So we went back and had her tell the story again, and we had to have her kind of without filming. So we had her on film, but where you see us cut away from her was where we asked her to kind of tell the story again and get it right. So she kind of messed up the story because she didn't really know the story. So we then intercut those two things. The other thing we wanted to do was just really start the film off with a bang. We really just wanted to start the film off in a way that would kind of, be something different, would push you, make you sit back in your seats and just kind of go with it. We wanted to do all of that. We wanted to use music. We found this great clip of the Chi-Lites, and so we wanted to use that, in the beginning of this film. We also, one of the hardest parts about making a documentary is what we call the backstory. Where do you start the story? And a lot of times you find that we want to have a huge amount of backstory, but once we get into editing, it doesn't work. So we have to cut it all out. And so we really wanted to try to get you to where we are in 1966 as soon as we possibly could. And so we do all of that pretty much in this first 2 or 3 minutes. So when we did Freedom Riders, we wanted to start with Gandhi and the whole idea of passive resistance and nonviolence and that whole thing. And we interviewed people about it. We had a whole thing cut with Gandhi, and we ended up just cutting it because, it was like you watched it and you're like, well, where are the Freedom Riders? Could we just get to the Freedom Riders, please? But, maybe now that people are making 7-hour documentaries, we can do a little bit better with that. So why don't we take a quick look at the beginning of the Panthers, which was, hugely successful for us. The film was, we originally were going to be in eight cities, and we ended up in 60 cities across the country. The film actually turned a profit, which never happens in documentary films, and it was the most watched documentary film on PBS in years and years and years. So let's just watch a few minutes of the opening.
There's an old story, and it's used in various cultures, where a group of blind men approach an elephant and try to describe him. The first man approaches the elephant, touches its side, and says, "It feels like a wall." The next man touches a tusk and says, "The elephant must be like a spear." Another blind man touches the trunk and says, "It feels like a snake." And that is quite often what happens with our descriptions of the Black Panther Party. We know the party we were in, and not the entire thing. We were making history, and it wasn't nice and clean. It wasn't easy, it was complex.
From Chicago, Illinois, the mighty Shallots.
For God's sake, give more power to the people. There's some people up there hogging everything.
The thing that led to the Panthers was what we were seeing on television every day, attack dogs, fire hoses, bombings.
We stand on the eve of a black revolution, brothers.
Now we have the emergence of voices within the community that were saying we're not going to continue to turn the other cheek.
You tell them white folk in Mississippi that all the scared niggas are dead. We want black power. We want black power. For God's sake, give more power to the people. For God's
This was a revolutionary time. 50 countries in the world gained their independence in the decade before the founding of the Black Panther Party. This is the time when people are getting drafted to go and fight in Vietnam. So if somebody's coming and saying, well, if you're going to fight, why not fight right here in LA or Oakland? That made a lot of sense.
We couldn't be absent and see what we saw. We couldn't unsee it. I was a cocktail waitress in a white strip club 2 years before I joined the Black Panther Party. How did that happen? The rage was in the streets. It was everywhere.
We're not gonna get nothing. Not by sitting around here doing these sitting demonstrations and nothing. People not gonna do anything. Well, how are we gonna do it? By violence. Violence. By uprising, having a revolution. Just put blood, let everybody bleed a little bit.
For God's sake, why don't you give more power? For God's sake.
As I was watching, I was thinking about the difference between that and $2 in a Dream, the beginning, and the difference, in my style and technology and what I know about filmmaking, and I think I've gotten a little bit better. I think that one of the important things for me in every film that I make is just try to get to be a little bit better as a filmmaker, and learn and try to use as many different tools as I can figure out to use to tell stories and tell stories in an emotional way. I just want to. Because I do want to have time for questions. I want to show you a little clip from the new film. I feel bad if we don't. Everybody who was here last night's already seen it, so you can go to sleep for the next minute and a half. But this is the opening of the new film called Tell Them We Are Rising. It's a history of historically black colleges and universities. It will air on PBS next February, not until next February, so we're doing promotions and stuff until then. We'll show you the kind of just opening title sequence. There's some cards like this outside if you want. If you want to know more about the film and about what we're doing, we have one of those numbers. So if you dial 555-888, 555-888, and then all in lowercase, the message would be HBC Rising. It'll then come to us, and we can then give you any information you might want to have on the film. That's 555-888. I sound like on a commercial. 555-888 HBC Rising. So let's take a look at the first minute and a half or so of HBC Rising, and then I'll answer questions. I think we're going to do the animation. This is the same. The very beginning of this film is the same animator that animated the elephant story.
This is the dream, grown young. The dream so bravely tended. Through a century of fears, through the years of working, praying, striving, learning, the dream become a beacon, brightly burning.
Colleges are spaces where Black people are affirmed.
You could be yourself and develop yourself in this rich soil.
It's a space that is an unapologetic Black space.
These are places where there's incredible freedom to explore.
We wanted to better ourselves. We wanted to have an institution where people like us all wanted to be more than the status quo.
The question for African Americans has always been, what is education's purpose? Who controls it? And what is the relationship of education to the broader aspirations of our people?
Well, that was weirdly kind of zoomed in. I don't know why, but it was cutting off half the thing. But anyway, that's the latest film. That's the beginning of the latest film we're doing, and just looking at doing a number of things. One of the things that we're really excited about doing next is a film on the Atlantic slave trade and the business of slavery, and we're hoping that we work with. in making this film come to life, but we're just starting there. So I guess I'm open to questions if there are any. Are there no questions?
I'll ask a question. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the creation of historical narrative in these. Is this on? Can you hear me?
I missed a couple of words.
Okay, sorry. I'll slow down. The creation of historical narrative in these films that are more about institutions, that kind of unlike the Emmett Till documentary that you discussed, kind of have a clear story. Do you lay out that narrative beforehand, or does it come in the editing bay? What is your process for figuring out how you're going to create a story around something that doesn't have a clear linear narrative?
So a lot of times we kind of lay it out very, very clearly, partially because we've done a number of films for National Endowment for the Humanities, and they make you kind of write a script. And so it's an exercise that we do a lot of times. Also, we've done a bunch of films for the show American Experience, and they wanted a script. So we do it, and then we kind of throw out the script once we get into editing and once we start doing the interviews. And, we kind of go with where we are. But the scripts are really helpful in knowing what the kind of what we call the beats of the story are. What we want to where we want to put emphasis, so that in Freedom Riders, that we knew that burning of the bus was a big piece of the story, a big deal. So that when we go into interviews, we will ask 5 or 6 people to tell us the same story, because we know that that's a piece of the story that we want to cover. But then once we get into it, it can look totally different. So with the Panthers, we didn't have the story of the elephant and the blind men. That was something that Erica gave us. The Shy-Lites singing "For God's Sakes, We Gotta Give More Power to the People." That was something that one of the researchers found, and we wanted to start with that. The whole idea of trying to tell some of the backstory right at the beginning, so we could launch right into the Panthers, came as we were editing. We were just like, we got to get to the Panthers really quick, because we don't have time to do this. When we made the Panther film, we spent a lot of time trying to start on the LA riots. Of 66, I believe it was 65, 66, that led into this, a lot of Panthers. We wanted to talk about Lowndes County, where there was a Black Panther party whose logo the Black Panthers stole, or borrowed. I don't want to say stole, borrowed. But we, once we got into it, we realized that we had to get moving. The other thing that's happened in my filmmaking, probably in the last 4 or 5 films, is we've made these films without narration. So it means that sometimes there's some things that we want to touch on, but we don't have a narrator. And if nobody kind of touches on it, we just either we have to go back and make somebody touch on it, or we just have to keep going. So it's harder to give every single little point that a narrator can give. But I think when you add it all up, it makes people respond to the film in a very different way. So instead of somebody's, saying the Black Panthers started in 1966 when Huey Newton was fed up with, the film itself tells you that, and you as a viewer feel like, you're making the connections instead of somebody making the connections for you, and so your perception of the film is different. Now, good narration is great, in some places, and sometimes you have to use it. But we've been fortunate enough to have great witnesses to be able to not use it in a bunch of the latest films that we've done. So it's a combination. To answer your question, it's a combination of both. We go into it very, with a script outline. Those really kind of color the questions that I ask, and really inform, how we ask questions and but then once we get into the edit room, it's it's the bites that people give us. It's the footage that we found. It's the music. It's all of those things that redirect the story, I think.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Any other? Okay. You guys are like the least questioning people that I've ever seen in my life. Most of the time people just want to come to the mic and make a statement. And even if it's not a question, they just come to the mic and just talk. But that's okay. Oh, good. Thank you so much. I just want to say I really appreciate everybody coming, and thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you all very much.